Hi dear students, today we are going to talk about food intoxications. When we look on the term food intoxications, we can feel that the food is being intoxicated, that is some toxin has been added into the food. So what is this and how is it different from the other foodborne infections? If you go to consider the general term food poisoning, the food poisoning can be caused by two different factors. It can be due to the presence of certain microbes, or it might be due to the presence of certain toxins. So, when a food poisoning is being caused by a bacteria, virus, parasite, protozoan, or any other microbe, or by the presence of the microbe in the food, it is referred to as a foodborne infection. Whereas we can see that unlike the foodborne infections, there are some infections which might be caused by the presence of certain toxins within the food. These can be of either natural or it can be by the preformed bacteria as well as chemical agents. So, when a food becomes poisoned by the presence of a toxin, that is referred to as a food intoxication. More frequently, we talk about food intoxications as the microbially loaded food intoxications. And in the case of foodborne infections, we can see that you have different microbes which are invading the body, especially the multiple linings of intestine, and they multiply over there and invade over there, and the presence of live microbes do occur in the case of foodborne infections. But in the case of food intoxications, here you do not have, it's not always that the microbe should invade over there or it should multiply over there. Even if the microbe is dead, sometimes it might, you can see the presence of toxins within the food, and that will result in the formation of a food intoxication. When you have a foodborne infection which takes place within hours to days, a food intoxication or the symptoms of food intoxication can happen within minutes to hours of having of food. And the symptoms of foodborne infections could include diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps and fever, whereas in the case of intoxications, it could be vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, weakness, respiratory failure, numbness, sensory as well as motor dysfunction can happen. And the thing is that in the case of food intoxication, the phenomenon of food intoxication or the symptoms of food intoxications is quite rapid because the toxin has been formed already. You need not wait for the microbe to be present or not in the case of a food intoxication. In food infection, another aspect that we should discuss here is the communicability. Food infection is communicable because it spreads from one person to the other. If a person becomes infected and he is having a foodborne infection, and if he is not properly washing his hands, okay, after he goes to the loo as well as the toilet or something like that, and if that hand will using that hand, if he touches surfaces or other food and someone uses that particular food, what happens? The foodborne pathogen could be transmitted from one person to the other. So that is a case of a foodborne infection. But in the case of a food intoxication, since the presence of the microbe is not much essential over there, it is not been found to be communicable here. And the factors responsible for the foodborne infections, they could include the inadequate cooking, cross-contamination, poor personal hygiene as well as the bare hand contact as we mentioned earlier. But in the case of food intoxications, it could be inadequate cooking, improper handling temperatures, that also can influence the food intoxications. Now you might think like, okay, can we make a distinction between like everything is a foodborne infection or everything is a food intoxication? You cannot do such a clear-cut demarcation, because there are situations in which to produce a food intoxication, microbes have to grow to a particular extent. Only then they will be able to produce food intoxications. In such cases, what happens? You cannot draw a strict line saying that a food infection and a food intoxication, like that you cannot draw a strict line between them. And so in the case of food intoxications, as we mentioned here, we are seeing the presence of microbial toxins in more generally, because we're talking about food microbiology over here. And these toxins, they produce symptoms shortly after the food is consumed, because the growth of the disease causing microorganism is not required over here. And these toxins can occur in two different forms. Either they can occur to be extracellular in nature, that is, the microbe is already releasing it after its growth and the microbe is dying, and but the toxin is being found within the food. Or in another case, what happens? The microbe is being found to be dead, but the toxin is being found to be intracellular in it. So the toxins can be extracellular as well as it can be intracellular. And as I mentioned earlier, you cannot give a strict clear-cut division between foodborne infection and food intoxications, because there are certain cases where in which the bacterial growth is also been essential to some point of time to produce a food toxin or a food intoxication. Now, one such example is E. coli O157H7. Okay, this is a enterohemorrhagic microbe of E. coli, which is mainly been formed by after the horizontal gene transfer happens between Shigella species and E. coli. And in this particular strain, it is referred to as an enterohemorrhagic strain. What is an enterohemorrhagic strain? A strain which will cause the hemorrhage. A hemorrhage happens and it mainly invades the enteric tract. What is a hemorrhage? A breaking of the blood vessel happens. Okay, so this particular strain has mainly been formed when a horizontal or a natural gene transfer mainly happened between E. coli and Shigella, and a region which was being coding for a toxin was being transferred from Shigella to E. coli. And as a result, what happens? E. coli O157H7 starts producing a toxin called the Shiga-like toxin. And in this case, we can see that if the disease has to form, or if an illness have to come in the case of E. coli O157H7, this microbe have to replicate to a particular level, only then sufficient toxin has been produced. So, to produce a food poisoning which has been caused by E. coli O157H7, you need to have a what? A high level of what? Microbial growth also. So it is also the presence of a food infection, a foodborne infection, as well as only if it reaches a particular count, the toxin production would be sufficient enough to cause the illness. Here, this Shiga-like toxin is responsible for a potentially life-threatening complication, and it is known as the hemolytic uremic syndrome, and it is mostly commonly found in children as well as in the elderly. Another example of bacterial food intoxication is in the case of Staphylococcus aureus. Staphylococcus aureus will produce two main toxins. Okay, not two, they produce mainly extracellular toxins, and the toxins will cause Staphylococcus enteritis. And the specialty of this particular disease is that you need not have the bacteria over here. Even then the toxin has been found to be active. Even after you properly cook the food, what happens? The toxin has been found to be heat resistant here. So cooking is not going to usually render the food safe. And if you take that particular food, within 2 to 6 hours, you will get the disease symptoms. What are the disease symptoms? You might get abdominal cramps, vomiting, severe diarrhea, as well as exhaustion. Now let me ask you, from where do you get the Staphylococcus aureus? There are different ways by which the food can get contaminated, but the most frequent and the most possible cause is Staph aureus itself has been found within our body in our human nasal cavity. So if a person who is preparing food, if he is not maintaining a proper hygienic condition, or if he is digging his nose and that finger is being touched on a food, and the food is being left over for several hours at a room temperature, what will happen? Staphylococcus aureus will multiply at a very rapid rate, and it will start producing various enterotoxins. by properly cooking it or boiling the food or properly cooking it, the Staphylococcus aureus might die. But what happens is the enterotoxin which Staphylococcus aureus has previously produced, that will remain, and it will result in the formation of the diseases associated with Staphylococcus enteritis. Now, what is enteritis? I am just explaining it to you. It is nothing but the inflammation of the enteric tract. And in the case of Staph aureus intoxications, you can see even cooking as well as thermal processes, even involved in canning processes, that will not be sufficient to bring about or to nullify the effects of the presence of these intoxications. We will be continuing in the next classes various other intoxications. Now, I have mentioned only 2 intoxications, one of E. coli and one of Staphylococcus aureus. We will be discussing the next type of intoxications in the coming slide, in the coming sessions. Thank you for now, students.